Class 11th, we are starting with this chapter, Mother's Day by J.B. Priestley. As in the introduction, I have told you this is a chapter which talks about the respect, the value which a mother deserves. The play is a humorous portrayal of the status of a mother in a family. Right? We find the mother is ill in this particular play. We find the mother is ill-treated. She is not given value. She is not given the respect which she deserves in the family from her husband or from her two kids. Now, how she reacts with the help of one of her friends, how she puts all the family members on the correct path, how she teaches them to value her, to value the efforts which she puts in for all of them. Now, the leading characters in the play are Mrs. Annie Pearson. We can call Mrs. Annie Pearson the protagonist of the play because the entire play revolves around her. Mr. George Pearson, that is Mrs. Annie Pearson's husband. Then we have Doris Pearson, and then we have Cyril Pearson, the two children of Pearsons. And a neighborhood friend by the name of Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now, the action takes place in the living room of Pearson's house in a London suburb, and it's a current time going on now. Now, the scene is the living room of Pearson family. Afternoon, it's a comfortably furnished, much lived-in room in a small suburban semi-detached villa. If necessary, only one door need be used, but it's better with two. One up left leading to the front door and the stairs, and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. So the setup is of the Pearson's house. There can be a muslin covered window in the left wall and possibly one in the right wall too. The fireplace is assumed to be in the fourth wall. There is a settee upright, an armchair down left and one down right. A small table with two chairs on either side of it stands at the center. Now, when the curtain rises, it is an afternoon in early autumn and the stage can be well lit. Mrs. Pearson at right and Mrs. Fitzgerald at left are sitting opposite each other at the small table, on which are two teacups and saucers, and the cards on which Mrs. Fitzgerald has been telling Mrs. Pearson's fortune. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is Mrs. Pearson's neighborhood friend, she is a fortune teller. So she is, the cards are spread on the table and perhaps she is telling Mrs. Pearson's fortune. Now, Mrs. Pearson is a pleasant but worried-looking woman in her 40s. So we find Mrs. Pearson a pleasant, though she is a sweet lady, but she is worried, in a worried woman in her 40s. And Mrs. Fitzgerald is older, heavier, and a strong, sinister personality. Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald is smoking. It is very important that these two should have sharply contrasting voice. Mrs. Pearson speaking in a light, flurried sound of tone, with a touch of suburban cockney, perhaps, and Mrs. Fitzgerald with a deep voice, rather Irish, perhaps. Now we have the opening scene introduces us to the two characters. First is Mrs. Fitzgerald and second is Mrs. Pearson. As you can see here in the picture also, the two of them sitting on the table, they are having a good conversation. As I told you, Mrs. Fitzgerald is a neighborhood friend of Mrs. Pearson, and she is a fortune teller, right? We all have seen that fortune tellers who carry some kind of cards. They're known as tarot cards. They carry those tarot cards, and with the help of those cards, they tell the fortune, right? So Mrs. Fitzgerald here is telling Mrs. Pearson's fortune. We can see, as in the picture also, Mrs. Pearson is a pleasant, but she's a worried-looking woman in her 40s. She's worried because of her family, because she doesn't get the respect, or nobody values her because of her efforts. Nobody cares for her. The family is hardly bothered about her. So we find that worry on her face, right? Now let's start with the play. What all the conversation is and how it goes about. Let's find it out. I want Darshika to read Mrs. Pearson's part, and I want Achal to read Mrs. Fitzgerald's part. Please, as I've told you, both the characters are contrasting. Mrs. Fitzgerald is that bold, daring lady who is sitting there telling the fortune. She's smoking, and Mrs. Pearson is quiet, peaceful, and at the same time she's worried. So your pitch should be accordingly. Let's start. Anshul, first it's your turn. Mrs. Fitzgerald.
And that's all I can tell you, Mr. Pearson. Could be a good fortune, could be a good one, could be a bad one. All depends on yourself now. Make up your mind, and there's it is.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. I am much obliged, I am sure. It's wonderful having a real fortune teller living next door. Did did you learn that are out east too?
Please continue.
I did. 12 years. I had of it with my old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster. He learnt a lot, and I learnt a lot more. But will you make up your mind now, Mr. Pearson dear? Put your foot down once and for all and be mistress of your own house and the boss of your own family.
That's easier said than done. Besides, I am so fond of them, even if they are so thoughtless and selfish. They don't mean to be.
Maybe not, but it to be better for them if they learn to treat you properly.
Yes, I suppose it would, in a way.
No doubt about it at all. Who's the better for your spoiled grown man, lad or girl? Nobody. You think it does them good when you run after them all the time, take their orders as if you were the servant in the house, stay at home every night while they go out enjoying themselves. Never in all yours life. It's the ruin of your them as well as husband, sons, daughter should be taking notice of wives and mothers not giving them orders and treating them like dirt. And don't tell me you don't know what I mean or know more than you told me.
I keep dropping a hint.
Hint? It's more than hint your family needs, Mr. Pearson.
I suppose it is, but I do hate any unpleasantness, and it's so hard to know where to start. I keep making up my mind to have it out with them, but somehow I don't know how to begin. Oh, good gracious. Look at the time, nothing ready, and they will be home any minute and probably all in a hurry to go out again.
Okay. Now the first, the opening scene, there's a conversation between these two ladies, Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald. Right? Mrs. Pearson just tells her how good it is to that fortune teller lives next to my door, and they're talking among themselves. She asks her, "From where have you learned that out in East too? Perhaps he has traveled somewhere else, or she has traveled to other countries also." And she's talking about, and she said, "No, I did 12 years, and I had of it. With my old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster, he learned a lot, and I learned a lot more. But will you make up your mind now, Mrs. Pearson, dear?" Now, Mrs. Fitzgill said that with my old man rising to be lieutenant quartermaster. So here she is talking about her family also. She's talking about her husband. And she says that along with him, I learned a lot. But then she says, then what about you, Mrs. Pearson? When are you going to put your foot down? Once for an all be the mistress of your own house and the boss of your own family. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, we find a bold lady, a lady who lives according to her whims and fancies. She cannot take orders. She cannot take commands at all. She is not that kind of a person who can easily be dominated by others. She doesn't gives up easily, right? So she's saying, when are you going to come out of your foot? When are you going to put your foot down? And when are you going to convey it to everybody that this is your family and you are the boss of your house? So Mrs. Pearson, in an apologetically manner, she smiles and say that it's quite easy to say. But the problem she says states here is that she's so fond of all of them. She loves so much all of them that every time, whatever they do or whatever they say, she just ignores it, right? She doesn't replies back to them also. They are thoughtless. She knows that. They are selfish. They're not concerned about her. But she says that I love them so much that there is no problem. I just leave it. I just ignore the talks and I ignore the things what all they are doing. Mrs. Fitzgerald here says, maybe not, but you would be better for them if they learn to treat you properly. He says, but if they try to treat you properly, if they treat you properly, things will be much better for you. Why do you want to suffer? So on this, Mrs. Fitzgerald says, Mrs. Pearson agrees to her, but she is a kind of a very soft lady who doesn't know how to treat people, especially her family members, in that harsh manner to put them on the right path. I believe parents or teachers or anybody in the family who is having a lot many responsibilities on their shoulders, at times soft, but at times they need to have that strict approach to put people on the right path, or to put children on the right path so that they are not misled. So that is what perhaps Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to explain it to Mrs. Pearson here. uh, so Mrs. Fitzgerald, in order to explain it to her more, she says, who is better for you being spoiled, a grown man, lad, or girl? Who is the better for being spoiled, who is better spoiled? Man, then man means she's talking about Mr. Pearson. Lad or a girl, her two kids. Nobody you think it does them good when you run after them. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to tell her that nobody is good to you when you are running after them, taking their orders. You stay at home every time, and after their work, when they come back, they go to enjoy themselves. They never even think about you, that you were also at home doing work for them. They never respect you. They never try to give it back to you what you do for you. They're not bothered about your efforts, basically. So Mrs. Fitzgerald further tells her that you are ruining them. Husbands, sons, and daughters should be taking notice of wives and mothers and not giving them orders and treating them like dirt. So, somewhere she's trying to explain it to her that you are having your own dignity. Maintain your dignity. You have your respect. If they are not respecting you, put them on the right path. Tell them you need something. Tell them that you are also human. You have been putting in so many efforts. You're working hard for them, making all kind of things arranged for them. So it's their moral duty also somewhere to respect her, to give importance to the values which she is putting in for you, the efforts which she is putting in for you, right? And if they, after the end of the day, they need a break, then you do not need a break. Why are they treating you like a dirt? So, and don't tell me you don't know what I mean, for I know more than you have told me. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald, being a smart lady, she says, please, Mrs. Pearson, do not give me excuses that you're not understanding what I want to say. I know, because what you have told me, I can see much more than that. So, Mrs. Pearson, I keep dropping a hint. So, Mrs. Pearson, again, in that very soft approach, she says, I keep dropping a hint. Means, in that soft tone, she keeps hinting here, family members, that she is not happy, when she wants something from life. But Mrs. Fitzgerald on this say, hint, it's more than hints your family needs. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, no, your family doesn't need hints anymore. They need that strict action to be taken, then only they will be on the right path. So Mrs. Pearson, says, I suppose it is. So on this, Mrs. Pearson says, I suppose it is, but I do hate any unpleasantness, and it is so hard to know where to start. So she say, basically, Mrs. Pearson says that she wants to put them on the right path, but again, because of her soft attitude, she's not able to take that thick stern action against them, and at the same time, she doesn't want any kind of unpleasantness in the home. So she says, then she again comes back to that, oh my God, I am busy talking, and it's time. They will be back. Nothing is ready, dinner is not ready, any moment minute they will be back, and they will be hurried to go out again, right? So as she's about to rise, Mrs. Fitzgerald reaches out across the table and pulls her down. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is now getting very angry how her friend is every time giving and giving, and she's not getting that respect back. So she tells her, now it's my turn. See, she pulls her down and tells her to sit down. Please continue from here, Mrs. Fitzgerald.
Let them wait or look after themselves for once. This is where your foot goes down. Start now.
Mrs. Fitzgerald, I know you mean well. In fact, I agree with you, but I just can't. And it's no use you trying to make me. If I promise you I did really make it out with them, I know I wouldn't be able to keep my promise.
Then let me do it.
Oh no, thank you very much, Mrs. Fitzgerald. But That wouldn't do at all. I couldn't possibly be somebody else. They had reasoned it at once and wouldn't listen, and really, I can't blame them. I know I ought to do it, but you see how it is.
You haven't got the idea.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you asked me to let you do it.
I did, but not as me as you.
But I don't understand. You couldn't be me.
We change places or really bodies. You look like me, I look like you, but that's impossible.
But that's impossible.
How do you know? Ever tried it?
No, of course not.
I have. Not for some time, but it's still out to work. Won't last long, but long enough for what we want to do. Learn it or out east, of course, where they are up all these tricks.
Well, I don't know. Is it right?
Wait, wait, wait. Now she holds her hand and across the table, keeping the cigarette in her mouth. Give me your hand, dear. Now, this is a very strange thing which Mrs. Fitzgerald is telling Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald, in the beginning, she was trying to tell her, stop taking up orders. Do something for yourself. Earn your respect. Ask them to value you. But when she finds that Mrs. Pearson will not be able to do that, so Mrs. Pearson says that even if I try to do that, even if I promise you that I'll be strict with them, I know I'm not going to keep that promise because I love them so much. I cannot be strict with them. I cannot say anything to them, right? So she says that wouldn't do at all. Mrs. Fritzkel says that okay, that if you cannot do it as a friend, let me do it. Let me handle your family. I'll put them all on the right path. But then again, Mrs. Pearson says, please do not do that because they would not. They are not going to take up if somebody else outsider intervenes in the family matter. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, then what will you do? You will be in the same manner. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, now here Mrs. Fitzgerald gives a suggestion to Mrs. Pearson. What she's saying, she's talking about the change of the interchanging the personalities of the two ladies. What Mrs. Fitzgerald tells her is that I have learned that when she learned that telling fortune, she says that I have learned this thing also from the East, that your body will be yours, right? But my personality will enter into your body and my body will be mine, but your personality will enter into my body. So at the front, the family members may find it that she is Mrs. Pearson, but bodily she is Mrs. Pearson, but internally she will be Mrs. Fritzgold. So this Mrs. Pearson, the changed Mrs. Pearson, who is internally Mrs. Fritzgold, is going to set them right. She says that this may not long last. This may not happen for a longer period, but yes, till that time that we can put them on the right path. So this is a very, though we understand this is not possible in today's life, in scientific world, it's not possible. But we have seen so many movies where that personality interchange concept is there. So here also Mrs. Fitzgerald says, I know the art of doing that magic and I can do it, right? Mrs. Pearson is a bit reluctant because she doesn't know how will things turn up to, will it be right or wrong? But then she says, I don't know. So here we find Mrs. Fitzgerald says, it's your only chance. This is the only chance you have. You give me your hands and keep quiet for a minute. Just don't think about anything. So Mrs. Fitzgerald tells her, please do not think about anything. Keep quiet and give me your hands. So this is some kind of a black magic or hypnotism. Whatever she's doing, basically she's interchanging the personality with Mrs. Pearson. Now, in the body of Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald will be transferred, and in the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson will be transferred. So, taking her hands, now look at me. They stare at each other, muttering, Ashtata Dam, Ashtata Lam, Ashtata Lam Dambona. That is something, some kind of magic spell or some words she's chanting the to interchange the personalities. Now, this little scene has to be acted very carefully. We have to assume that the personalities change bodies. Now, this is an assumption. Now, obviously, it's a fiction, so we can understand the personalities are interchanged. After the spell, has been spoken, both women still grasping hands, Golax, as if the life were out of them. So both of them, after the personalities were interchanged, both of them, they were like almost unconscious, as if life has been taken out of them. Then both come to life, but with the personality of the other. Means in the body of Mrs. Pearson, it's Mrs. Fitzgerald now, and vice versa. So each must try to adopt the voice and mannerisms of the other. So now Mrs. Pearson is bold and dominating. Now it is other way around. Now Mrs. Pearson, because internally she is Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is bold and dominating, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is internally Mrs. Pearson now, is nervous and fluttering. Right? Am I clear till this point? I'll take a pause there, please. We'll take a pause here, dear.